And I'm yeah. I could get myself a new canned intro because it seems these days I always know that at least one person is here. It's mad. Well, a heady feeling to be able to be aware that I'm reading to someone and not no one. But yeah, what are we doing today? I think we're caught up on. Oh, hello, Shadow. Yeah, I know, terrible.
Ah, the rat.
How about good to have you too? Yeah. But yeah, I was just about to say I think we're caught up on announcements, but no, we're not, are we? We're caught up on thanking people who've followed and subscribed and done all that. But I have to give the entire community a very big shout out and thank you indeed, because as of today, I am a Twitch affiliate, which, from what I am told by Lamp, means that I can start earning the fancy cheese with some regularity. Yeah, now, I don't know exactly how that works. Lamp tells me that he has adjusted the advert settings until they are exactly perfect, which I don't know what that means. I don't know how it works. Apparently, occasionally there will be strange visions beamed to your heads, which will in some way benefit me or Lamp or someone. And he says that it's set up so that when that happens, I will be informed, so I can take a break from the story, so you don't get, you don't miss out on them. So those will probably be times when I'll do a bit more of my speculation and sort of literary commentary in the middle of things. So that's the thing that's happening. Anything else? Oh, yeah, there was. There might have been a slight issue with, for those of you who was watching Fugi Theatre yesterday, slight mess up with the badge drop that was supposed to be happening. Apparently I messed up the time zone, so that the event didn't start until partway through. So if you were watching, you might not have gotten the badge. If you didn't, let me know and I'll set something up to compensate you somehow. Maybe I'll put together like a blank event where you can just stick it on in the background and get the badge free or something. I don't know. Blah. Always teething problems, but it wouldn't be a SkitterSkreetch without some or mostly scuff. So, yeah. What else? Good work, lads. Good work, good progress. Oh, and tomorrow we're doing Torrid Tuesday again, where I'll be reading whatever chat tells me to. So, stop by if you feel like making me read something. There's all sorts of books in this library, a whole selection of them. Look at all these books I've got. You could make me read any one of them, or, as I know you inevitably will, some sort of horrible fan fiction written by someone with problems. So, you know, but you have the choice, and that's the important thing. Yeah, I think that's the only things I've got really to say. That being the case, I don't know if I'm supposed to answer this, but we do have a couple more emotes. We've got one follower one, which is cheese you can throw at me, and then we got a sub one, and I've done an animated one. I don't know if that one's coming through, and I also don't know if the animated ones are subscriber only or if they're follower ones. So something is happening with emotes. At the very least, you can throw cheese at me. Well, not today, there won't be. Tomorrow, there might be. Today, we're doing ghost stories. Which, speaking of, here we are. We got 3 more of the M.R. Jameses, which I've been enjoying, surprisingly. I'm still not sure if these are like entirely fictional ones or if he has just been writing down accounts. I can't find any sort of scholarship on it, and I can't make my mind up based on my own opinion. But yeah. But we'll keep reading through them. Today we got Count Magnus, one weirdly called "Oh Whistle and I'll Come, My Lad," "Come to You, My Lad," and then the Treasure of Abbot Thomas. Yeah, I think altogether these should be a pretty decent little one stream load. There's about 80 pages, but we'll see how we get on. And of course, as always, if you missed something, if I've said something and gone too fast, if I've stumbled over something, or if you just have any thoughts or comments, do feel free to let me know, and I'm always happy to have a chat or go back over or do whatever. Yeah. I think that's it for now. So, unless anyone has anything to say, then without any further ado, we shall start with Count Magnus. By what means the papers out of which I have made a connected story come into my hands is the last point in which the reader will learn from these pages. It is necessary to prefix my extracts from them a statement of the form in which I possess them. They consist then partly of a series of collections for a book of travels, such a volume as was common product of the 40s and 50s. I think that would be 1840s and 1850s. Horace Marryat's Journal of a Resident in Jutland and the Danish Isles is a fair specimen of the class to which I allude. These books usually treated of some unfamiliar district on the continent. They were illustrated with woodcuts or steel plates. They gave details of hotel accommodation and a means of communication such as we now expect to find in any well-regulated guard book, and they dealt largely in reported conversations with intelligent foreigners, racy innkeepers and garrulous peasants. In a word, they were chatty. Begun with the idea of furnishing material for such a book, my papers, as they progressed, assumed the character of a record of one single personal experience, and this record was continued up to the very eve almost of its termination. The writer were a Mr. Wraxall. For my knowledge of him, I have to depend entirely on the evidence that was writing afford, and from these I deduced that he were a man past middle age, possessed of some private means, and very much alone in the world. He had, it seems, no settled abode in England, but were a denizen of hotels and boarding houses. It is probable that he entertained the idea of settling down at some future time, which never came. And I think it also likely that the Pantechnicon fire in the early 70s must have destroyed a great deal that would have thrown light on his antecedents, for he refers once or twice to property it is that was warehoused at that establishment. It is further apparent that Mr. Wraxall had published a book, and that it treated of an holiday he had once taken in Brittany. More than this I cannot say about his work, because a diligent search in bibliographical works has convinced me that it must have appeared either anonymously or under a pseudonym. As to his character, it is not difficult to form some superficial opinion. He must have been an intelligent and cultivated man. It seems that he was near being a fellow of his college at Oxford, brass nose as I was a judge from the calendar. His besetting fault were pretty clearly that of over-inquisitiveness, possibly a good fault in a traveller, certainly a fault for which this traveller paid dearly enough in the end. On what proved to be his last expedition, he was plotting another book. Scandinavia, a region not widely known to Englishmen 40 years ago, had struck him as an interesting field. He must have lighted on some old book of Swedish history or memoirs, and the idea had struck him that there was room for a book descriptive of travel in Sweden, interspersed with episodes from the history of some of the great Swedish families. He procured letters of introduction, therefore, to some persons of quality in Sweden, and set out thither in the early summer of 1863. Of his travels in the north there is no need to speak, nor of his residence for some weeks in Stockholm. I need only mention that some savant resident there put him on the track of an important collection of family papers belonging to the proprietors of an ancient manor house in Västergötland, and obtained for him permission to examine them. The manor house, or Ergard, in question is to be called Raback, pronounced something like Roback, though that is not his name. It is one of the best buildings of all its kind in the country, and the picture of it in Dahlenberg's Sueca Antica e Moderna, engraved in 1694, shows it very much as the tourist may see it today. It was built soon after 1600, and is, roughly speaking, very much like an English house of that period in respect of material. Red brick with stone facings and style. The man who built it were a scion of the great house De la Gardie, and his descendants possess it still. De la Gardie is the name by which I will designate them when mention of them becomes necessary. They received Mr. Wraxall with great kindness and courtesy, and pressed him to stay in the house as long as his researches last. But, preferring to be independent and mistrusting his powers of conversing in Swedish, he settled himself at the village inn, which turned out quite sufficiently comfortable, at any rate, during the summer months. This arrangement would entail a short walk daily to and from the manor house, to something under a mile. The house itself stood in a park, and were protected, we should say grown up, with large old timber. Near it you found the walled garden, and then entered a close wood fringing, one of the small lakes with which the old country is pitted. Then came the wall of the domain, and you climbed the steep knoll, another rock lightly covered with soil, and on the top of this stood the church, fenced in with tall dark trees. It were a curious building to English eyes. The nave and aisles were low, and filled with pews and galleries. In the western gallery stood the handsome old organ, galley painted and with silver pipes. The ceiling was flat and had been adorned by a 17th century artist with a strange and hideous Last Judgment, full of lurid flames, falling cities, burning ships, crying shoals, and brown and smiling demons. Handsome brass coronae hung from the roof, and the pulpit was like a doll's house, covered with little painted wooden cherubs and saints. A stand with 3 hourglasses were hinged to the preacher's desk. Such sights as these may be seen in the church in Sweden now, but what distinguished this one were an addition to the original building. At the eastern end of the north aisle, the builder of the manor house had erected a mausoleum for himself and his family. It was a large 8-sided building, lighted by a series of oval windows, and it had a domed roof, topped by a kind of pumpkin-shaped object, raised into a spire, a form in which Swedish architects greatly delighted. The roof were copper externally, and were painted black, while the walls, in common with those of the church, were startlingly white. This mausoleum there were no access from the church. It had a portal and steps of its own on the northern side. Past the churchyard, the path to the village goes, and not more than 3 or 4 minutes bring you to the inn door. On the first day of his stay at Rabak, Mr. Axel found the church door open and made those notes of the interior which I have epitomised. Into the mausoleum, however, he could not make his way. He could, by looking through the keyhole, just descry that there were fine marble effigies in sarcophagi of copper, and a wealth of armorial ornament, which made him very anxious to spend some time in investigation. The papers he had come to examine at the manor house proved to be just the kind he wanted for his book. There were family correspondence, journals, and account books of the earliest owners of the Rita estate, very carefully kept and clearly written, full of amusing and picturesque detail. The first Dilagardi appeared in them as a strong and capable man. Shortly after the building of the mansion, there had been a period of distress in the district, and the peasants had risen and attacked several chateaux and done some damage. The owner of Rabak took a leading part in suppressing the trouble, and there were references to executions of ringleaders and severe punishment inflicted with no sparing hand. The portrait of this Magnus Dilagardi was one of the best in the house, and Mr. Axel studied it with no little interest after his day's work. He gives no detailed description of it, but I gather that the face impressed him rather by its power than by its beauty or goodness. In fact, he writes that the Count Magnus was an almost phenomenally ugly man. On this day, Mr. Axel took his supper with the family, and walked back in the late but still bright evening. I must remember, he writes, to ask the sexton if he can let me into the mausoleum of the church. He evidently has access himself, for I saw him tonight standing on the steps, and, as I thought, locking or unlocking the door. I found that early on the following day Mr. Axel had some conversation with his landlord. His setting it down at such length as he does surprised me at first, but I soon realised that the paper I was reading were, at least in their beginning, the materials for the book he was meditating, and that it were to have been one of those quasi-journalistic productions which admit of the introduction of an admixture of conversational matter. His object, he says, were to find out where any traditions of Count Magnus Dilagardi lingered on in the scenes of that gentleman's activity, and whether the popular estimate of him were favourable or not. He found that the Count was decidedly not a favourite. If his tenants came late with their work on the days which they owed to him as lord of the manor, they were sat on the wooden horse or flogged and branded in the manor house yard. 1 or 2 cases there were of men who had occupied lands which encroached on the lord's domain, and whose houses had been mysteriously burnt on a winter's night, with the whole family inside. But what seemed to dwell on the innkeeper's mind most, for he returned to the subject more than once, was that the Count had been on the Black Pilgrimage, and had brought something or someone back with him. You'll naturally inquire, as Mr. Axel did, what the Black Pilgrimage may have been. But your curiosity on the point must remain unsatisfied, for the time being just as his did. The landlord were evidently unwilling to give a full answer, or indeed any answer on the point, and being called out for a moment, trotted off with obvious alacrity, only putting his head in at the door for a few minutes afterwards to say that he were called away to Skara, and should not be back till evening. So Mr. Axel had to go unsatisfied to his day's work at the manor house. The papers on which he was just then engaged soon put his thoughts into another channel, for he had to occupy himself with glancing over the correspondence between Sophia Albertina in Stockholm and her married cousin Ulrich Lenora at Rabak in the years 1705 to 1710. The letters were of exceptional interest from the light they threw upon the culture of that period in Sweden, as anyone can testify who has read the full edition of them in the publication of the Swedish Historical Manuscripts Commission. In the afternoon, he had done with these, and after returning the boxes in which they were kept in their places on the shelf, He proceeded very naturally to take down some of the volumes nearest them, in order to determine which of them had best be his principal subject of investigation next day. The shelf he had hit upon were occupied mostly by a collection of account books in the writings of the first Count Magnus. But one among them was not an account book, but a book of alchemical and other tracts in another 16th century hand. Not being very familiar with alchemical literature, Mr. Wraxall spends a space in which he might have spared in setting out the names and beginnings of the various treaties. The Book of the Phoenix, Book of the 30 Words, Book of the Toad, Book of Miriam, Turba Philosophorum, and so forth. And then he announces, with a good deal of circumstance, his delight at finding, on a leaf originally left blank, near the middle of the book, some writing of Count Magnus himself, headed Liber Nigre Peregrinationes. It is true that only a few lines were written, but there were more than enough to show that the landlord had that morning been referring to a belief at least as old as the time of Count Magnus, and probably shared by him. This is the English of what were written. If any man desires to obtain a long life, if he would obtain the faithful messenger and see the blood of his enemies, it is necessary that he should first go into the city of Chorazin, and there salute the prince. Here there were an erasure of one word, not very thoroughly done, so that Mr. Wraxall felt pretty sure that he would write and read it as Aris, of the air. There were no more of the text copied, only a line in Latin. Quaere reliqua hugis materia in the sectortores. See the rest of this matter among the more private things. It could not be denied that this threw a rather lurid light upon the tastes and beliefs of the Count, but to Mr. Wraxall, separated from him by nearly 3 centuries, the thought that he might have added to his generational forcefulness alchemy, and to alchemy something like magic, only made him a more picturesque figure. And when, after a rather prolonged contemplation of his picture in the hall, Mr. Wraxall set out on his homeward way, his mind was full of the thoughts of Count Magnus. He had no eyes for his surroundings, no perceptions of the evening scents of the woods, or the evening light on the lake. When all of a sudden he pulled up short, he was astonished to find himself already at the gate of the churchyard, and within a few minutes of his dinner. His eyes fell on the mausoleum. "Ah," he said, "Count Magnus, there you are. I should dearly like to see you." Like many solitary men, he writes, I have a habit of talking to myself aloud, and unlike some of the Greek and Latin particles, I do not expect an answer. Certainly, and perhaps fortunately in this case, there were neither voice nor any that regarded. Only the woman who, I suppose, was cleaning up the church, dropped some metallic object on the floor, whose clang startled me. Count Magnus, I think, sleeps sound enough. That same evening, the landlord of the inn, who had heard Mr. Wraxall say that he wished to see the clerk or deacon, as he would be called in Sweden, of the parish, introduced him to that official in the inn parlour. A visit to the Delegati Tombhouse was soon arranged for the next day, and a little general conversation ensued. Mr. Wraxall, remembering that one function of Scandinavian deacons is to teach candidates for confirmation, thought he would refresh his own memory on a biblical point. "Can you tell me," he said, "anything about Chorazin?" The deacon seemed startled, but readily reminded him how the village had once been denounced. "To be sure," said Mr. Wraxall. "It is, I suppose, quite a ruin by now." "So I expect," replied the deacon. "I have heard some of our old priests say that the Antichrist is to be born there, and there are tales." "Ah, what tales are those?" Mr. Wraxall put in. "Tales, I was going to say, which I have forgotten," said the deacon, and soon after that he said good night. The landlord were now alone, and at Mr. Wraxall's mercy, and that inquirer were not inclined to spare him. "Herr Nelson," he said, "I found out something about the Black Pilgrimage. You may as well tell me what you know. What did the Count bring back with him?" Swedes are habitually sly, perhaps, in answering, or perhaps the landlord were an exception. I'm not sure. Mr. Wraxall notes that the landlord spent at least 1 minute in looking at him before he said anything at all. Then he came close up to his guest, and with a good deal of effort he spoke. "Mr. Wraxall, I can tell you this one little tale and no more, not any more. You must not ask anything when I have done. In my grandfather's time, that is 92 years ago, there were 2 men who said, 'The Count is dead, we do not care for him. We will go tonight and have a free hunt in his woods, the long wood on the hill that you have seen behind the Ravak.' Well, those that heard them say this, they said, 'No, do not go. We are sure you will meet with persons walking who should not be walking. They should be resting, not walking.' These men laughed. There were no forest men to keep the wood, because no one wished to hunt there. The family were not here at the house. These men could do what they wished. Very well, they go to the wood that night. My grandfather was sitting here in this room. It was the summer and a light night. With the window open, he could see out to the woods and hear. So he sat there, and 2 or 3 men with him, and they listened. At first they hear nothing at all. Then they hear someone. You know how far away it is. They hear someone scream, just as if the most inside part of his soul was twisted out of him. All they sat so for 3/4 of an hour. Then they hear someone else, only about 300 ells off. They hear him laugh out loud. It was not one of those 2 men that laughed, and indeed, they have all of them said that it was not any man at all. After that, they hear a great door shut. Then, when it was just light with the sun, they all went to the priest. They said to him, Father, put on your gown and your ruff, and come to bury these men, Anders Björnsson and Hans Torbjörn. You understand that they were sure these men were dead. So they went to the wood. My grandfather never forgot this. He said they were all like so many dead men themselves. The priest too, he was in a white fear. He said when they came to him, I heard one cry in the night, and I heard one laugh afterwards. If I cannot forget that, I shall not be able to sleep again. So they went to the woods, and they found these men on the edge of the wood. Hans Torbjörn was standing with his back against the tree, and all the time he was pushing with his hands, pushing something away from him, which was not there. So he was not dead, and they led him away, and took him to the house at Nykrylong, and he died before the winter, but he went on pushing with his hands. Also Anders Björnsson was there, but he was dead. And I tell you this about Anders Björnsson, that he was once a beautiful man, but now his face was not there, because the flesh of it was sucked away off the bones. You understand that? My grandfather did not forget that. And they laid him on the bier which they brought, and they put a cloth over his head, and the priest walked before, and they began to sing the song for the dead as well as they could. So they were singing the end of the first verse. One fell down, and was carrying the head of the bier, and the others looked back, and they saw the cloth had fallen off, and the eyes of Anders Björnsson were looking up, because there was nothing to close over them, and this they could not bear. Therefore the priest laid the cloth upon him, and sent for a spade, and they buried him in that place. The next day Mr. Axel records that the deacon called for him soon after his breakfast, and took him to the church and mausoleum. He noticed that the key of the latter were hung on a nail just by the pulpit, and it occurred to him that, as the church door seemed to be left unlocked as a rule, it would not be difficult for him to pay a second and more private visit to the monuments if there proved to be more of interest among them than could be digested at first. The building, when he entered it, he found not unimposing. The monuments, mostly large erections of the 17th and 18th centuries, were dignified if luxuriant, and the epitaphs and heraldry were copious. The central space of the domed room were occupied by 3 copper sarcophagi, covered with finely engraved ornament. 2 of them had, as is commonly the case in Denmark and Sweden, a large metal crucifix on the lid. The third, that of Count Magnus as it appeared, had instead of that a full-length effigy engraved upon it. Around the edges were several bands of similar ornament representing various scenes. One were a battle with cannon belching out smoke, and walled towns and troops of pikemen. Another showed an execution. In a third, among trees, were a man running at full speed with flying hair and outstretched hands. After him followed a strange form. It would be hard to say whether the artist had intention for it to be a man, and were unable to give the requisite similitude, or whether it were intentionally made as monstrous as it looked. In view of the skill with which the rest of the drawing were done, Mr. Axel felt inclined to adopt the latter idea. The figure unduly short, and were for the most part muffled in a hooded garment, which swept the ground. The only part of the form which projected from that shelter were not shaped like any hand or arm. Mr. Axel compares it to the tentacle of a devilfish, and continues, On seeing this, I said to myself, this then, which is evidently an allegorical representation of some kind, a fiend pursuing a hunted soul, may be the origin of the story of Count Magnus and his mysterious companion. Let us see how the huntsman is pictured. Doubtless it will be a demon blowing his horn. But as it turned out, there were no such sensational figure, only the semblance of a cloaked man on a hillock, who stood leaning on a stick and watching the hump with an interest, which the engraver had tried to express in his attitude. Mr. Axel noted the finely worked and massive steel padlocks, 3 in number, which secured the sarcophagus. One of them he saw were detached and lay on the pavement, and then, unwilling to delay the deacon longer or to waste his own work and time, he made his way on the manor house. It is curious, he notes, how on retracing a familiar path one's thoughts engross one to the absolute exclusion of surrounding objects. Tonight, for the second time, I had entirely failed to notice where I was going. I had planned a private visit to the tomb house to copy the epitaphs, when suddenly, as it were, awoke to consciousness and found myself, as before, turning into the churchyard gate, and, I believe, singing or chanting some such words as, "Are you awake, Count Magnus? Are you asleep, Count Magnus?" And then something more, which I have failed to recollect. It seemed to me that I must have been behaving in this nonsensical way for some time. He found the key of the mausoleum where he had expected to find it, and copied the great part of what he wanted. In fact, he stayed until the light began to fail him. "I must have been wrong," he writes, in saying that one of the padlocks of the Count's sarcophagus was unfastened. "I see tonight that two are loose. I picked both up and laid them carefully on the window ledge, after trying unsuccessfully to close them. The remaining one is still firm, and though I take it to be a spring lock, I cannot guess how it is opened. Had I succeeded in undoing it, I am almost afraid I should have taken the liberty of opening the sarcophagus. It is strange, the interest I feel in this personality. It is strange the interest I feel in the personality of this, I fear, somewhat ferocious and grim old noble." The day following were, as it turned out, the last of Mr. Raxel's stay at Rabak. He received letters connected with certain investments which made it desirable that he should return to England. His work among the papers was practically done, and travelling was slow. He decided, therefore, to make his farewells, put some finishing touches to his notes, and be off. These finishing touches and farewells, it turned out, took more time than he had expected. The hospitable family insisted on his staying to dine with them. They dined at 3, and it was verging on 6:30 before we were outside the iron gates of Rabak. He dwelt on every step of his walk by the lake, determined to saturate himself, now that he tried it for the last time, in the sentiment of the place and hour. And when he reached the summit of the churchyard knoll, he lingered for many a good minute, gazing at the limitless prospect of woods, near and distant, all dark beneath a sky of liquid green. When at last he turned to go,
the rat!
"Ivy, good to have you." We're just about the end of the first of our ghost stories, but if you hang around a moment, we'll be doing a new one, I think. But we're about to get to the spooky bit. And when he reached the summit of the churchyard knoll, he lingered for many minutes, gazing at the limitless prospect of wood, near and distant, all dark beneath a sky of liquid green. When at last he turned to go, the thought struck him that surely he must bid farewell to Count Magnus, as well as the rest of the Delegades. The church was about 20 yards away, and he knew where the key of the mausoleum hung. It was not long before he was standing over the great copper coffin, and as usual talking to himself aloud. "You may have been a bit of a rascal in your time, Magnus," he was saying, "and for all that I should like to see you, or rather—" Just at that instant, he says, I felt a blow on my foot. Hastily enough I drew it back, and something fell on the pavement with a clash. It was the third, the last of the 3 padlocks which had fastened the sarcophagus. I stooped to pick it up, and heaven is my witness that I am writing only the bare truth. Before I had raised myself there was a sound of metal hinges creaking, and I distinctly saw the lid shifting upwards. I may have behaved like a coward, but I could not for my life stay for one moment. I was outside that dreadful building in less time than I can write, almost as quickly as I could have said the words. And what frightens me yet more, I could not turn the key in the lock. As I sit here in my room, noting these facts, I ask myself, it was not 20 minutes ago, whether that noise of creaking metal continued, and I cannot tell whether it did or not. I only know that there was something more that I have written that alarmed me, but whether it was sound or sight I am not able to remember. What is this that I have done? Poor Mr. Raxel. He set out on his journey to England the next day, as he had planned, and he reached England in safety, and yet, as I gather from his changed hand and inconsequent jottings, a broken man. One of several small notebooks that have come to me with his papers gives, not a key to, but a kind of inkling of his experience. Much of his journey was made by canal boat, and I find not less than 6 painful attempts to enumerate and describe his fellow passengers. The entries are of this kind. 24. Pastor of a village in Scan. Usual black coat and soft black hat. 25. Commercial traveller from Stockholm going to Trollhättan. Black cloak, brown hat. 26. Man in a long black cloak, broad-leaved hat, very old-fashioned. This entry is lined out and a note added, perhaps identical with number 13. I have not yet seen his face. On referring to number 13, I find that he is a Roman priest in a cassock. The next result of the reckon is always the same. 28 people appear in the enumeration, one being always a man in a long black cloak and broad hat, and the other a short figure in dark cloak and hood. On the other hand, it is always noted that only 26 passengers appear at meals, and that the man in the cloak is perhaps absent, and the short figure is certainly absent. On reaching England, it appears that Mr. Axel landed at Harwich, and he resolved at once to put himself out of the reach of some person or persons whom he never specifies, but whom he evidently come to regard as his pursuers. Accordingly, he took a vehicle, or closed flyer, not trusting the railway, and drove across country to the village of Belchamp St. Paul. It was about 9 o'clock on a moonlight August night when he neared the place. He was sitting forward and looking out the window at the fields and thickets. There was little else to be seen, racing past him. Suddenly he came to a crossroad. At the corner 2 figures were standing motionless. Both were in dark cloaks. The taller one wore an hat, the shorter an hood. He had no time to see their faces, nor did they make any motion that he could discern. The horse shar violently and broke into a gallop, and Mr. Axel sunk back into his seat in something like desperation. He had seen them before. Arrived at Belchamp St. Paul, he was fortunate enough to find a decent furnished lodging, and for the next 24 hours he lived, comparatively speaking, in peace. His last notes were written on this day. They are too disjointed and ejaculatory to be given here in full, but the substance of them is clear enough. He is expecting a visit from his pursuers. How or when he knows not. His constant cry is, "What has he done?" and "Is there no hope?" Doctors he knew, those would call him mad. Policemen would laugh at him. The parson is away. What can he do but lock his door and cry to God? People still remembered last year at Belchamp St. Paul how a strange gentleman come one evening in August years back. Now the next morning but one he were found dead, and they were on inquest, and the jury that viewed the body fainted, 7 of them did, and none of them wouldn't speak to what they see, and the verdict was visitation of God. Now the people as keep of the house moved out that same week, and went away from that part, but they do not, I think, know any glimmer of light has ever been thrown or could be thrown on the mystery. It so happened that last year the little house came into my hands as part of a legacy. It had stood empty since 1863, and there seemed no prospect of letting it, so I had it pulled down, and the papers of which I have given you an abstract were found in a forgotten cupboard under the window in the best bedroom. And that's the end of Count Magnus. Ooh. So yeah. So first things first, there was no warning when ads came to me, so that's a little annoying, but hopefully no one missed anything too significant. I'll have to punch around with that, see if we can figure it out. But yeah, let's do a little bit of thinking over then, shall we? So, first things first, we've got an old manor house, an old family, a vicious and, unliked nobleman, cruel of his people, known to commit various crimes, and known to have gone on what is called the Black Pilgrimage, and practitioner of alchemy. Specifically, this pilgrimage was taken to a city where it is said that the Antichrist will be born, and each night that the visiting man investigating him passes by his tomb, he speaks out and greets him, and seemingly a padlock falls away from his mausoleum. And the investigating man is pursued by 2 figures pictured on that mausoleum, onto the ends of the earth, or at least so far as England, from Scandinavia, and thence on to death. Once again, I am torn as to whether or not to believe this an account or a story. Like, because the sort of setting up and relaying of the story, like especially the actual account by which it is gained, that makes it sound fictional, right? Like that's not the sort of thing that really happens. You don't, get hold of a manor house and tear it down and then there's a ghost story. Especially if you're, someone known for collecting ghost stories. It would be a tremendous piece of luck for those ghost stories to fall in your hand like that. But then, there's again not a lot to it. It's just, yeah, spooky thing happened. We don't really know what happened. This fella died. And so all of them seem to end. Either this fella died and that's the end of it, or they solved it and they went away. Hey Nazca, day's going pretty good. Yeah. Lamps stopped burning quite so much oil, so it's not. It's cooling down a bit down here, so it's a bit more comfortable. Spent the day doing a lot of prep, figuring out all the affiliate stuff, which I'm dead pleased with. That's going well. Struggling a bit with the ads, but I think it's going to work out anyway. Yeah. I do appreciate it. But what are we doing? Yeah. Again, so I'm still torn on whether these are actual accounts of ghost stories that he's found, or if they're I mean, the ads is good for me. It's just that I thought I'd set it up so that they would tell me when they were playing, so that I could stop and let the story not be interrupted. But that's not showing up at the minute, so I've got to figure that out. Still, what was I saying? What was I? Yes, yeah. Still can't decide whether these M.R. Jameses are accounts of actual ghost stories related by people, or if they are fictional ones he's made up. Which I suppose, in a way, means that they're good in either sense. Either they're compelling enough that he is, they're compelling enough stories that they sound like they could be real events or accounts that has been put down, or they're well enough fictionalized accounts that they are, despite being the mundane real things, they sound like they could be fiction. I really do like them. And I think there's still quite a few more of these to dig out. There's someone had a big old collection of them. I think because another thing making me think that these may be actual accounts is that these were in one of the sort of more magical sections, rather than like most of my fiction stuff I get from personal libraries of wizards who work down here. But these were in one of these low spiritualism sections, which Lamp says that they would have been. It was exercise books where it was some sort of account or study or something, but I don't know, they're good. I'm enjoying them. Yeah, I'll have a quick drink of water, and I think that's all I've got to say about Cat Magnus, so we'll move on to the next one. Unless, of course, any of you have something to say about Cat Magnus that I have not thought of. Right then. So, moving right on then. This one is the oddly named "Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad." And I say it's oddly named not just because it's quite a long title, but I will point out, because I don't know where you can make it out, this title is in quotes, so it is directly a quote from someone. "I'll whistle and I'll come to you, my lad." "I suppose you will be getting away pretty soon now that full term is over, Professor," said a person not in the story to the Professor of Ornithography soon after they had sat down next to each other at a feast in the hospitable hall of St. James College. The Professor was young, neat and precise in speech. "Yes," he said. My friends have been making me take up golf this term, and I mean to go to the East Coast. In point of fact, to Burnstow, I dare say you know of it, for a week or 10 days to improve my game. I hope to get off tomorrow." "Oh, Parkins," said his neighbour on the other side, "if you are going to Burnstow, I wish you would look up the side of the Templars' Preceptory, and let me know if you think it would be any good to have a dig there in the summer." It were, as you might suppose, a person of antiquarian pursuits who said this, but since he merely appears in this prologue, there is no need to give his entitlements. "Certainly," said Parkins the Professor. "If you will describe to me whereabouts this site is, I will do my best to give you an idea of the lie of the land when I get back. Or I could write to you about it if you would not tell me where you are likely to be." "Don't trouble to do that, thanks. It's only that I'm thinking of taking my family in that direction in the long, and it occurred to me that very few of the English preceptories have ever been properly planned. I might have an opportunity of doing something useful on off days." The Professor rather sniffed at the idea that planning out a preceptory could be described as useful. His neighbour continued. "This site, I doubt if there's anything showing above ground, must be down quite close to the beach now. The sea is encroached tremendously, as you know, all along that bit of coast. I should think from the map that it must be about 3/4 of a mile from the Globe Inn at the north end of the town. Where are you going to stay?" Well, at the Globe Inn, as a matter of fact, said Parkins. I have engaged a room there. I couldn't get anywhere else. Most of the lodging houses are shut up in winter, it seems. And as they tell me that is the only room of any size I can have, is really a double-bedded one, and they haven't a corner in which to store the other bed, and so on. But I must have a fairly large room, for I'm taking some books down, and I mean to do a bit of work. No, I don't quite fancy having an empty bed, nor to speak of two, in what I may call for the time being my study. I suppose I can manage to tough it for the short time I shall be there. You call having an extra bed in your room roughing it, Parkins? Said a bluff person opposite. Look here, I shall come down and occupy it for a bit. I'll be company for you. The professor quivered, but managed to laugh in a courteous manner. By all means, Rogers. There's nothing I should like better. But I'm afraid you would find it rather dull. You don't play golf, do you? No, thank heaven, said the rude Mr. Rogers. Well, you see, when I'm not writing, I shall most likely be out on the links, and I'm afraid that, as I would rather be dull for you, I'm afraid. Oh, I don't know. There's certain to be somebody I know in the place. But of course, if you don't want me, speak the word, Parkins. I shan't be offended. Truth as you always tell it, is never offensive. Parkins were indeed scrupulously polite and strictly truthful. It is to be feared that Mr. Rogers sometimes practised upon his knowledge of these characteristics. In Parkins' breast there was a conflict now raging, which for a moment or two did not allow him to answer. Then, it all being over, he said, Well, if you want the exact truth, Rogers, I was considering whether the room I speak of would really be large enough to accommodate us both comfortably, and also whether, mind I shouldn't have said this if you hadn't pressed me, you would not constitute something in the nature of a hindrance to my work. Roger laughed loudly. Well done, Parkins, I said. That's all right, I promise not to interrupt your work. Don't you disturb yourself about that. No, I won't come if you don't want me. But I thought I should do so nicely to keep the ghosts off. Here he might have been seen to wink and nudge his neighbour. Parkins might also have been seen to become pink. I beg pardon, Parkins, Roger continued. I oughtn't have said that. I forgot you didn't like levity on these topics. Well, Parkins said, as you have mentioned the matter, I freely own that I do not like careless talk about what you call ghosts. A man in my position, he went on, raising his voice a little, cannot, I find, be too careful about appearing to sanction the current beliefs on such subjects. As you know, Rogers, as you ought to know, for I think I have never concealed my views. No, you certainly have not, old man, put in Rogers sotto voce. I hold that any semblance, any appearance of concession to the view that such things might exist is equivalent to a renunciation of all that I hold most sacred. But I'm afraid I have not succeeded in securing your attention. Your undivided attention was what the Blimber actually said, Roger interrupted, with every appearance of an earnest desire for accuracy. But I beg your pardon, Parkins, I'm stopping you. No, not at all, said Parkins. I don't remember Blimber. Perhaps it was before my time. But I didn't go on. I'm sure you know what I mean. Yes, said Rogers rather hastily. Just so. I'll go into it fully at Burnstow or somewhere. In repeating the above dialogue, I have tried to give the impression which it made on me that Parkins was something of an old woman, rather M-like perhaps in his little ways, totally destitute, alas, of a sense of humour, at the same time dauntless and sincere in his convictions, and a man deserving of the greatest respect. Where not the reader has gathered so much, that was the character which Parkins had. On the following day, Parkins did, as he had hoped, succeed in getting away from the college, and arriving at Burnstow. You were made welcome at the Globe Inn, were safely installed in the large double-bedded room on which we have heard, and were able, before retiring, the rest to arrange his materials for work in apple pie order upon a commodious table which occupied the outer end of the room and was surrounded on three sides by windows looking out seaward. That is to say, the central window looked straight out to sea, and those on the left and right commanded prospects along the shore at the north and south respectively. On the north, no houses were to be seen, but only the beach and the low cliff backing it. Immediately in front were a strip, not considerable, of rough grass, dotted with old anchors, capstans and so forth. Then a broad path, and the beach. Whatever may have been the original distance between the Globe Inn and the sea, not more than 60 yards now separated them. The rest of the population of the inn were, of course, a golfing one, and included a few elements that call for special description. The most conspicuous figure was, perhaps, that of an ancien militaire, secretary of a London club, and possessed of a voice of incredible strength and views of a pronouncedly Protestant type. These were apt to find utterance, after his attendance, upon the ministrations of a vicar, an estimable man, with inclinations towards a picturesque ritual, which he gallantly clapped down as far as he could out of deference to East Anglian tradition. Professor Parkins, one of whose principal characteristics were pluck, spent the greater part of the day following his arrival at Burnstow in what he had called improving his game, in company with his Colonel Wilson. And during the afternoon, whether the process of improvement were the blame or not, I'm not sure, the Colonel's demeanour assumed a colouring so lurid that even Parkins jibed at the thought of walking home with him from the links. He determined, after a short and furtive look at that bristling moustache and those incarnadine features, that it would be wiser to allow the influences of tea and tobacco to do what they could with the Colonel before the dinner hour should render a meeting inevitable. I might walk home tonight along the beach, he reflected. Yes, and take a look, there will be light enough for that, at the ruins of which Disney was talking. I don't exactly know where they are, by the way, but I expect I can hardly help stumbling on them. This he accomplished, I may say, in the most literal sense, for in picking his way from the links to the shingle beach, his foot caught partly in a gorse root and partly in a biggish stone, and over he went. When he got up and surveyed the surroundings, he found himself in a patch of somewhat broken ground covered with small depressions and mounds. The latter, which he come to examine them, proved to be simply masses of flints embedded in mortar and grown over with turf. He must, he quite rightly concluded, be on the site of the preceptory he had promised to look at. It seemed not unlikely to reward the spade of the explorer. Enough of the foundation were probably left at no great depth to throw a good deal of light on the general plan. He remembered vaguely that the Templars, to whom the site had belonged, were in the habit of building round churches, and thought a particular series of the humps or mounds near him did appear to be arranged in something of a circular form. Few people can resist the temptation to try a little amateur research in a department quite outside their own, if only for the satisfaction of showing how successful they would have been had they only taken it up seriously. Our professor, however, if he felt something of this mean desire, were also truly anxious to oblige Mr. Disley, so he paced with care at the circular area he had noticed, and wrote down its rough dimensions in his pocket-book. Then he proceeded to examine an oblong eminence which lay east of the centre of the circle, and seemed to his thinking likely to be the base of a platform or upper. At one end of it, the northern, a patch of the turf were gone, removed by some boy or other creature, fera natura. It might, he thought, be as well to probe the soil here for evidence of masonry, and he took out his knife and began scraping away the earth. And now followed another little discovery. A portion of soil fell inward as he scraped and disclosed a small cavity. He lighted one match after another to help him to see what nature of the hole was, but the wind was too strong for them all. By tapping and scratching the sides with his knife, however, he was able to make out that it must be an artificial hole in the masonry. It was rectangular, and the sides, top and bottom, if not actually plastered, were smooth and regular. Of course it were empty. No. As he withdrew the knife he heard a metallic clink, and when he introduced his hand it met with a cylindrical object lying on the floor of the hole. Naturally enough, he picked it up, and when he brought it into the light, now fast fading, he could see that it too was of a man's making. A metal tube about 4 inches long, and evidently of some considerable age. By the time Parkins had made sure there was nothing else in the odd receptacle, it was too late and too dark for him to think of undertaking any further search. What he had done had proved so unexpectedly interesting that he determined to sacrifice a little more of the daylight on the morrow with archaeology. The objects which he now had safe in his pocket were bound to be of some slight value at least, he felt sure. Bleak and solemn with a view on which he took a last look before starting homeward. A faint yellow light in the west showed the links on which a few figures moving towards the clubhouse were still visible. The squat Martella Tower, the lights of Aldsey Village, the pale ribbon of sands intersected at intervals by black wooden groins, the dim murmuring sea. The wind was bitter from the north, but we were at his back when he set out for the globe. He quickly rattled and clashed through the shingle and gained the sand, upon which, but for the groins, which had to be got over for every few yards, the going was both good and quiet. One last look behind to measure the distance he had made since leaving the ruined Templars church showed him a prospect of company on his walk, in the shape of a rather indistinct personage, who seemed to be making great efforts to catch up with him, but made little if any progress. I mean that there were an appearance of running about his movements, but that the distance between him and Parkins did not seem materially to lessen. So at least Parkins thought, and decided that he almost certainly did not know him, and that it would be absurd to wait until he come up. For all that, company, he began to think, would really be very welcome on that lonely shore, if only you could choose your companion. In his unenlightened days he had read of meetings in such places, which even now would hardly bear thinking of. He went on thinking of them, however, until he reached home, and particularly of one which catches most people's fancy at some time of their childhood. Now I saw in every dream that Christian had gone but a very little way when he saw a foul fiend coming over the field to meet him. What should I do now? He thought. If I looked back and caught sight of a black figure sharply defined against the yellow sky, and saw that it had horns and wings, I wonder whether I should stand or run for it. Luckily the gentleman behind is not of that kind, and he seems to be about as far off now as when I saw him first. Well, at this rate, he won't get his dinner as soon as I shall. And dear me, it's within a quarter of an hour of the time now. I must run. Parkins had, in fact, very little time for dressing. When he met the Colonel at dinner, peace, or as much of her as that gentleman could manage, reigned once more on the military bosom. Nor was she put to flight in the hours of bridge that followed dinner. The Parkins were a more than respectable player. When, therefore, he retired towards 12 o'clock, he felt that he had spent his evening quite a satisfactory way, and that even for so long as a fortnight or 3 weeks, life at the Globe would be supportable under similar conditions. Especially, thought he, if I go on improving my game. As he went along the passage, and he met the boots of the Globe, who stopped and said, "I beg your pardon, sir, but I was a brushing your coat just now, and there was something fell out in your pocket. I put it on your chest of drawers, sir, in your room, sir. A piece of paper or something like that, sir. Thank you, sir. You'll find it on your chest of drawers, sir? Yes, sir. Good night, sir." The speech served to remind Parkins of his little discovery that afternoon. It was some considerable curiosity that he turned it over by the light of his candles. They were of bronze, he now saw, and were shaped very much after the manner of the modern dog whistle. In fact, it was, yes, certainly it was, actually no more or less than a whistle. He put it to his lips, but they were quite full of fine caked-up sand or earth, which would not yield to knock him, but must be loosened with a knife. Tidy as ever in his habits, Parkins cleared out the earth onto a piece of paper, and took the latter to the window to empty it out. The night was clear and bright, and as he saw when he had opened the casement, and he stopped for an instant to look out at the sea, a note of belated wanderer situated on the shore in front of the inn. Then he shut the window, a little surprised at the late hours people kept in Burnstow, and took his whistle to the light again. Why, surely there were marks on it, and not merely marks, but letters. A very little rubbing rendered the deeply cut inscription quite legible, but the Professor had to confess, after some earnest thought, that the meaning of it were obscure to him as the writing on the wall to Belshazzar. There were legends both on the front and the back of the whistle. The one read thus, and I'm going to take a moment to describe this because it is laid out slightly oddly. But there are 4 pieces of text written in sort of cross-section as though they were on the points of a compass. At the top of the north is Fla, F-L-A. To the left, as would be west, is Fur, F-U-R. To the right, as would be east, is Bis, B-R-S. And to the bottom, as would be south, Fle, F-L-E. The other side, and this piece of text, is flanked by a pair of swastikas. Though I do believe that this being written before the advent of the Second World War would be the older sort of Hindu interpretation of the symbol. But, the other side, Quis est iste qui venit? Quis est iste qui venit? I ought to be able to make it out, he thought. But I suppose I'm a little rusty in my Latin, and I come to think of it, I don't believe I even know the word for a whistle. The long one does seem simple enough. It ought to mean, who is this who is coming? Well, the best way to find out is evidently to whistle for him. He blew tentatively and stopped suddenly, startled and yet pleased at the note he had elicited. It had a quality of infinite distance in it, and, soft as it were, he somehow felt it must be audible for miles around. There was a sound, too, that seemed to have the power, which many scents possess, of forming pictures in the brain. He saw quite clearly for a moment a vision of a wide, dark expanse at night, with a fresh wind blowing, and in the midst a lonely figure. How employed he could not tell. Perhaps he would have seen more had not the picture been broken by the sudden surge of gust of wind against his casement, so sudden that it made him look up, just in time to see a white glint of a seabird's wing somewhere outside the dark pines. The sound of the whistle had so fascinated him that he could not help trying it once more, this time more boldly. The note were little, if at all, louder than before, and the repetition broke the illusion. No picture followed, as he had half hoped it might. But what is this? Goodness! What force the wind can get up in a few minutes! What a tremendous gust! There! I knew that window fastening was no use. Ah, I thought so. Both candles out. It's enough to tear the room to pieces. The first thing was to get the window shut. While you might count 20, Parkins was struggling with the small casement, and felt almost as if he were pushing back a sturdy burglar, so strong was the pressure. It slackened all at once, and the window banged to and latched itself. Now, to relight the candles and see what damage, if any, had been done. No, nothing seemed amiss. No glass even were broken in the casement. But the noise had evidently roused at least one member of the household. The Colonel would have been heard stumping in his own stocking feet on the floor above and growling. Quickly as it had risen, the wind did not fall at once. On it went, moaning and rushing past the house, at times raising a cry so desolate that Parkins disinterestedly said it might have made a fanciful people feel quite uncomfortable. Even the unimaginative, he thought, after a quarter of an hour, might be happier without it. Whether it were the wind or the excitement of golf, or the research in the preceptory that kept Parkins awake, he were not sure. Awake he remained, in any case, long enough to fancy, as I'm afraid I often do myself under such conditions, that he was the victim of all manner of fatal disorders. He would lie counting the beats of his heart, convinced that it was going to stop work with every moment, and would entertain grave suspicions of his heart, lungs, brain, liver, etc. Suspicions which he was sure would be dispelled by the return of daylight, which until then refused to be put aside. He found a little vicarious comfort in the idea that someone else were in the same boat. A near neighbour, in the darkness it was not easy to tell his direction, were tossing and rustling in his bed too. The next stage was that Parkins shut his eyes and determined to give sleep every chance. Here again overexcitement asserted itself in another form, that of making pictures. Experto crede, pictures do come to the closed eyes of one trying to sleep, and are often so little to his taste that he must open his eyes and disperse them. Parkins' experience on this occasion were a very distressing one. He found that the picture which presented himself to him was continuous. When he opened his eyes, of course, it went, but when he shut them once more, it framed itself afresh, and acted itself out again, neither quicker nor slower than before. And what he saw was this: a long stretch of shore, shingled, edged by sand, and intersected at short intervals with black groins, running down to the water. A scene, in fact, so like that of his afternoon's walk, that in the absence of any landmark, it could not be distinguished therefrom. The light were obscure, conveying an impression of gathering storm. Late winter evening and slight cold rain. On this bleak stage, at first no actor were visible. Then, in the distance, a bobbing black object appeared. A moment more, and it were a man running, jumping, clambering over the groins, and every few seconds looking eagerly back. The nearer he came, the more obvious it were that he was not only anxious, but even terribly frightened. His face were not to be distinguished. He were, moreover, almost at the end of his strength. On he come. Each successive obstacle seemed to cause him more difficulty than the last. Will he get over the next one? Thought Parkins. It seems a little higher than the others. Yes. Half climbing, half throwing himself, he did get over it, and fell all in a heap on the other side, the side nearest to the spectator. There, as if really unable to get up again, he remained, crouching under the gravestone, under the groin, looking up in an attitude of painful anxiety. So far no cause whatever for the fear of the runner had been shown, but now there began to be seen, far up the shore, a little flicker of something, light-coloured, moving to and fro with great swiftness and irregularity. Rapidly growing larger, it, too, declared itself as a figure in pale, fluttering draperies, ill-defined. There was something about its motion which made Parkins very unwilling to see it at close quarters. It would stop, raise arms, bow itself towards the sand, then run stupid across the beach to the water's edge, and back again, and then rising upright once more continue its course forward at a speed that was startling and terrifying. The moment come when the pursuer were hovering about from left to right, only a few yards beyond the groin where the runner lay in hiding. After 2 or 3 ineffectual castings hither and thither, it came to a stop, stood upright with arms raised high, and then darted straight forward towards the groin. It was at this point that Parkins always failed in his resolution to keep his eyes shut. With many misgivings as to incipient failure of eyesight, overworked brain, excessive smoking, and so on, he finally resigned himself to light his candle, get out a book, and pass the night waking, rather than be tormented by this persistent panorama, which he saw clearly enough could only be a morbid reflection of his walk and his thoughts on the very day. The scraping of his match on box and the glare of the light must have startled some creatures of the night, rats or whatnot, which he heard scurry across the floor from the side of his bed, with much rustling. Dear, the match is out, thought it is. The second one burnt better, and a candle and book were duly produced, over which Parkins poured till sleep of an wholesome kind come upon him, and that in no long space. For about the first time in his orderly and prudent life, he forgot to blow out the candle, and when he was called next morning at 8, there was still a flicker in the socket, and a mess of guttered grease on the top of the little table. After breakfast, he was in his room, putting the finishing touches on his golfing costume. Fortune had again allotted the Colonel to him for a partner, when one of the maids came in. "Oh, if you please," she said. "Would you like any extra blankets on your bed, sir?" "Ah, thank you," said Parkins. "Yes, I think I should like one. It seems likely to turn rather cold now. In a very short time the maid were back with a blanket. Which bed should I put it on, sir? She asked. What? Why, that one, the one I slept in last night, he said, pointing out. Oh yes, I beg your pardon, sir, but you seem to have tried both of them. Leastways we had to make them both up this morning. Really? How very absurd, thought Parkins. I certainly never touched the other except to lay some things in it. Did it actually seem to have been slept in? Oh yes, sir, said the maid. Why, all the things was crumpled and thrown about hallways, if you'll excuse me, sir. Quite as if anyone hadn't passed but a very foreign night's sleep, sir. Dear me, said Parkins. Well, I may have disordered more than I thought when I unpacked my things. I'm very sorry to have given you the extra trouble, I'm sure. I expect a friend of mine soon, by the way, a gentleman from Cambridge, to come and occupy it for a night or two. That will be all right, I suppose, won't it? Oh, yes, to be sure, sir. Thank you, sir. It's no trouble, I'm sure, said the maid, and departed, to giggle with her colleagues. Parkins set forth with a stern determination to improve his game. I'm glad to be able to report that he succeeded so far in the enterprise that the Colonel, who had been rather repining at the prospect of a second day's play in company, became quite chatty as the morning advanced. And his voice boomed out over the flats, as certainly also of our own minor poets have said, like some great Bourdon in a minster tower. Extraordinary wind that we had last night, he said. In my old home we should have said someone had been whistling for it. Should you indeed, said Parkins. Is there a superstition of that kind still current in your part of the country? I don't know about superstition, said the Colonel. They believe it all over Denmark, and in Norway, as well as on the Yorkshire coast. In my experience, mind you, there is generally something at the bottom of what country folk hold to, and have held to for generations. But it's your drive, whatever might have been the golfing rule, or whatever it might have been. A golfing reader will have to imagine the appropriate digression at the proper intervals. When conversation returned, Parkins said with a slight hesitancy, Apropos of what you were saying just now, Colonel, I think I ought to tell you that my own views on such subjects are very strong. I am, in fact, a convinced disbeliever in what is called the supernatural. What? Said the Colonel. Do you mean to tell me you don't believe in second sight, or ghosts, or anything of that kind? In nothing whatsoever of that kind, returned Parkins firmly. Well, said the Colonel, but it appears to me that rate, sir, you must be a little better than Sadducee. Parkins were on the point of answering that, in his opinion, the Sadducees were the most sensible persons he had ever read of in the Old Testament, but, feeling some doubt as to whether much mention of them would be found in that work, he preferred to laugh at the accusation off. Perhaps I am, he said, but here, give him my click. Here, give him my click, boy. Excuse me one moment, Colonel. A short interval. Now, as to whistling for the wind, let me give you my theory about it. The laws which govern wind are really not all perfectly known. The fisher folk and such, of course, not known at all. A man or woman of eccentric habits, perhaps, or a stranger is seen repeatedly on the beach at some unusual hour, and is heard whistling. Soon afterwards a violent wind rises. A man who could read the sky perfectly, or who possessed the barometer, could have foretold that it would. The simple people of a fishing village have no barometers, and only a few rough rules for prophesying weather. What more natural than the eccentric personage I postulated should be regarded as having raised the wind, or that he or she should clutch eagerly at the reputation of being able to do it? Now take last night's wind. As it happens, I myself was whistling. I blew a whistle twice, and the wind seemed to come absolutely in answer to my call. If anyone had seen me... The audience had been a little restive under this harangue, and Parkins had, I fear, fallen somewhat into the tone of a lecturer. At the last sentence, the Colonel stopped. Whistling earlier, he said. And what sort of whistle did you use? Play this stroke first. Interval. About that whistle you were asking, Colonel. It's rather a curious one. I have it in my... no, I see I've left it in my room. As a matter of fact, I found it yesterday. Then Parkins narrated the manner of his discovery of the whistle, upon hearing which the Colonel grunted, and upon that, in Parkins' place, he should himself be careful about using the fin that had belonged to the set of papists, of whom, speaking generally, it might be affirmed that you never knew what they might have been up to. From this topic he diverged to the enormities of the vicar, who had given notice on the previous Sunday that Friday would be the feast of St. Thomas the Apostle, and there would be service at 11 o'clock in the church. This and other similar proceedings constituted, in the Colonel's view, a strong presumption that the vicar were a concealed papist, if not a Jesuit, and Parkins, who could not very readily follow the Colonel in this region, did not disagree with him. In fact, they got on so well together in the morning that there was no talk on either side of their separating after lunch. Both continued to play well during the afternoon, or at least well enough to make them forget everything else until the light began to fail them. Not until then did Parkins remember that he had meant to do some more investigating at the preceptory. But it were of no great importance, he reflected. One day were as good as another. Might as well go home with the Colonel. As they turned the corner of the house, the Colonel were almost knocked down by a boy who rushed into him at the very top of his speed, and then, instead of running away, remained hanging on to him and panting. The first words of the warrior were naturally those of reproof and objuration, but he very quickly discerned that the boy were almost speechless with fright. Inquiries were useless at first, while the boy got his breath, and he began to howl, still clutching the Colonel's leg. He were at last detached, but continued his howl. "What in the world is the matter with you? What have you been up to? What have you seen?" said the two men. "Oh, I see it wave at me out the window," wailed the boy, "and I don't like it." "What window?" said the irritated Colonel. "Come, pull yourself together, boy. The front window at the hotel," said the boy. At this point, Parkins were in favour of sending the boy on, but the Colonel refused. He wanted to get to the bottom of it, he said. It was more dangerous to give a boy such a fright as this one, and if it turned out that people were playing jokes, they should suffer for it in some way. And by a series of questions, he made out this story. The boy had been playing about on the grass in front of the globe with some others. Then they had gone home and they had teased, and he was just going when he happened to look up at the front window and see it a-waving at him. It seemed to be a figure of some sort, in white as far as he knew. Couldn't see its face, but it waved at him, and it wasn't a right thing. Well, I say not a right person. Was there a light in the room? No, he didn't think to look if there were a light. Which were the window? Well, the top one or the second one? The second one, it were. A big window that's got two little ones at the side. "Very well, my boy," said the Colonel after a few more questions. "You run away back home now. I expected it was some person trying to give you a start. Another time, like a brave English boy, you just throw a stone. Well, no, not that exactly, but you go and speak to the waiter or to Mr. Simpson, the landlord, and... Yes, and I say that I have advised you to do so." The boy's face expressed some of the doubts he felt as to the likelihood of Mr. Simpson's lending a favourable ear to his complaint, but the Colonel did not appear to have perceived this, and went on. "And here's a sixpence. No, I see it's a shilling. And you be off home, and don't think any more about it." The youth hurried off with agitated thanks, and the Colonel and Parkins went round to the front of the globe and reconnoitred. There was only one window answering the description they had been hearing. "Now that's curious," said Parkins. "It's evidently my window the lad was talking about. Will you come up for a moment, Colonel Wilson? You ought to be able to see if anyone's been taking liberties in my room." They were soon in the passage, and Parkins made as if to open the door. Then he stopped and felt in his pockets. "This is more serious than I thought," was his next remark. "I remember now that before I started this morning I locked the door, and it is locked now, and what is more, here is the key." And he held it up. "Now," he went on, "if the servants are in the habit of going on to one's room during the day when one is away, I can only say that, well, I don't approve of it at all." Conscious of a somewhat weak climax, he busied himself in opening the door, which were indeed locked, and in lighting candles. "No," he said, "nothing seems to be disturbed." "Except your bed," put in the Colonel. "Excuse me, that isn't my bed," said Parkins. "I don't use that one, but it does look as if someone has been playing tricks with it." They certainly did. The clothes were bundled up and twisted together in a most tortuous confusion. Parkins pondered. "That must be it," he said at last. "I disordered the clothes last night in unpacking, and they haven't made it since. Perhaps they came in to make it, and that boy saw them through the window, and then they were called away and locked the door after them. Yes, I think that must be it." "Well, ring and ask," said the Colonel, and this appealed to Parkins as practical. The maid appeared, and, to make a long story short, deposed that she had made the bed in the morning when the gentleman was in the room, and hadn't been there since. No, she had no other key. Mr. Simpson, he kept the keys. He'd be able to tell the gentleman if anyone had been up. This was a puzzle. Investigation showed that nothing of value had been taken, and Parkins remembered the disposition of the small objects on the table and so forth well enough to be pretty sure that no pranks had been played with them. Mr. and Mrs. Simpson furthermore agreed that neither of them had given the duplicate key of the room to any person whatever during the day. Nor could Parkins, fair-minded as a man as he was, detect anything in the demeanour of master, mistress, or maid that indicated guilt. He was much more inclined to think that the boy had been imposing upon the Colonel. The latter was unwontedly silent and pensive at dinner and throughout the evening. When he bade good night to Parkins, he murmured a gruff undertone, "You know where I am if you want me during the night." Yes, well, thank you, Colonel Wilson, I think I do. But there isn't much prospect of my disturbing you, I hope. By the way," he added, "did I show you that old whistle I spoke of? I think not. And here it is." The Colonel turned it over gingerly in the light of the candle. "Can you make anything of the inscription?" asked Parkins when he took it back. "No, not in this light. What do you mean to do with it?" "Oh, well, when I get back to Cambridge I shall submit it to some of the archaeologists and see what they think of it. And very likely, if they consider it worth having, I may present it to one of the museums." Said the Colonel. "Well, you may be right. All I know is that if it were mine I should chuck it straight in the sea. No use talking, as I'm well aware, but I expect that with you it's a court..." cause of live and learn, a case of live and learn. I hope so, I'm sure, and I wish you a good night. He turned away, leaving Parkins and Act to speak at the bottom of the stair, and soon each were in his own bedroom. By some unfortunate accident, there were neither blinds nor curtains on the window of the Professor's room. The previous night he had thought little of this, but the night there seemed every prospect of a bright moon rising to shine directly on his bed, and probably wake him later on. When he noticed this, he was a good deal annoyed, but with an ingenuity which I can only envy, he succeeded in rigging up, with the help of a railway rug, some safety pins and a stick and an umbrella, a screen which, if only held together, would completely keep the moonlight off his bed, and shortly afterward he was comfortably in that bed. When he had read that somewhat solid work long enough to produce a decided wish for sleep, he cast a drowsy glance round the room, blew out the candle, and fell back upon the pillow. He must have slept soundly for an hour or more, when a sudden clatter shook him up in the most unwelcome manner. In a moment he realised what had happened. His carefully constructed screen had given way, and a very bright frosty moon was shining directly on his face. This was highly annoying. Could he possibly get up and reconstruct the screen? Or could he manage to sleep if he did not? For some minutes he lay and pondered over the possibilities, and he turned over sharply, and with all his eyes open, lay breathlessly listening. There had been a movement, he was sure, in the empty bed on the opposite side of the room. Tomorrow he would have it moved, for there must be rats or something playing about in it. It was quiet now. No, the commotion had begun again. There were rustling and shaking, surely more than any rat could cause. I could figure myself something of the Professor's bewilderment and horror, for I have been in a dream that 30 years back, seeing the same thing happen. But the reader will hardly, perhaps, imagine how dreadful it was to him to see a figure suddenly sit up in what he had known were an empty bed. He was out of his own bed and in one bound, and made a dash towards the window, where lay his only weapon, the stick with which he had propped his screen. This were, as it turned out, the worst thing he could have done, because the personage in the empty bed, with a sudden smooth motion, slipped from the bed, and took up position with outspread arms between his two beds and in front of the door. Parkins watched it in horrid perplexity. Somehow the idea of getting past it and escaping through the door was intolerable to him. He could not have borne, he did not know why, to touch it. And as for its touching him, he would sooner dash himself through the window than have that happen. He stood for the moment in a band of dark shadow, and he had not seen what his face was like. Now it began to move, in stooping posture, and all at once the spectator realised, with some horror and some relief, that it must be blind, and seemed to feel about with its muscled arms in groping, random fashion. Turned enough away from him, it became suddenly conscious of the bed he had just left, and darted towards him, and bent over and felt the pillows in a way which made Parkins shudder as he had never in his life thought possible. In a very few moments it seemed to know that the bed were empty, and then moving forward into the area of light and facing the window, it showed for the first time what manner of thing it were. Parkins, who very much dislikes being questioned about it, did once describe something of it in my hearing, and I gather that what he chiefly remembers about it is an intensely horrible face of crumpled linen. What expression he read upon it he could not or would not tell, but that fear of it went nigh to maddening him is certain. We were not at leisure to watch it for long. With formidable quickness it moved to the middle of the room, and as it groped and waved, one corner of its drapery swept across Parkins' face. He could not, though he knew how perilous the sound was, he could not keep back a cry of disgust, and this gave the searcher an instant clue. It leapt towards him on the instant, and the next moment he were halfway through the window backwards, uttering cry upon cry at the utmost pitch of his voice, and the linen face were thrust close to his own. At this, almost the last possible second, deliverance come, as you will have guessed. The Colonel burst the door open and was just in time to see the dreadful group at the window. When he reached the figures, only one were left. Parkins sank forward into the room in a faint, and before him on the floor lay a tumbled heap of bedclothes. Colonel Wilson asked no questions, but busied himself in keeping everyone else out of the room, and getting Parkins back onto his bed, and himself, wrapped in a rug, occupied the other bed for the rest of the night. Early on the next day, Rogers arrived, more welcome than he would have been a day before, and the three of them had a very long consultation in the Professor's room. At the end of it, the Colonel left the hotel door, carrying a small object between his finger and thumb, which he cast as far into the sea as a very brawny arm could send it. Later on, the smoke of a burning ascended from the back of the premise of the globe. Exactly what explanation were patched up for the staff and visitors at the hotel, I must confess I do not recollect. The Professor was somehow cleared of the ready suspicion of delirium tremens, and the hotel had a reputation of a troubled house. There is not much question as to what would have happened to Parkins if the Colonel had not intervened when he did. He would either have fallen out of the window or else lost his wits. It is not so evident what more the creature had come in answer the whistle could have done them frightened. There seemed to be absolutely nothing material about it, save the bedclothes of which it had made itself a body. The Colonel, who remembered a not very dissimilar occurrence in India, were of the opinion that if Parkins had closed with it, he really could have done very little, and that its one power was that of frightening him. The old thing, he said, served to confirm his opinion of the Church of Rome. There was really nothing more to tell, but as you may imagine, the Professor's views on certain points are less clear-cut than they used to be. His nerves too have suffered. He cannot even now see a surplice hanging on a door, quite unmoved. And the spectacle of a scarecrow on a field on a late winter afternoon has cost him more than one sleepless night. And that's the end of our whistle and our company here. That is an odd one. It's a little bit more action-packed than you generally get from a ghost story. You have Perkins, this sort of, obviously, like the non-believer who's doing it wrong. Ooh. Thank you, Naska. Yeah, Perkins, you've got the non-believer, the sort of, you know, clearly in the wrong in this sort of piece. And the Colonel is sort of a fighter man. I don't know. It almost makes me think of some of Lovecraft's more, what's called rough and tumble stuff. But, yeah. It's an interesting little figure as well, because it's not, like, again, I'm really torn as to whether these are actually accounts or if these are stories he's made up. But this one, again, there's not a full explanation of it. It is just a thing that happens and then how the people deal with it and survive or fail to survive. In this case, you have the whistle, which is, I guess you'd call it some sort of a cursed object. I'm trying to think out what else really. Yeah, I mean, whistle, cursed object. Yeah, I mean, obviously poking around in an old church that has been abandoned, the thing. And there are a few accounts of Catholics doing funny things in these stories, which, I mean, yeah, it's not unheard of. Catholic priests and dioceses are known to have, well, I mean, I say Catholic one specifically. Any priest or bishop is generally, like, you know, a man of learning and given a little oversight from the church is quite likely to interfere with odd things. But also, you know, makes sense that the Templars would be sealing away a cursed object like that. But yeah. I'm trying to think if there's anything else to note of it. We have another mention of Martello Tower, which I think is interesting. These are very, very British ghost stories in their way. But yeah, I don't think there's too much else to say. But I think I'm probably going to call it after this one because my throat is starting to go a bit. And much as I enjoy these stories, I've been enjoying them. We've got one more to go. I think if I read that one, which is slightly longer than the other two, I'll do myself some damage for us. Thank you kindly, Naska. Do I agree? But yeah, there's distinctly some strain coming on the voice, so I certainly shouldn't press it too far, especially since I got a I got Torrid Tuesdays tomorrow, and that's a planned event, as opposed to this, which is just me hanging around and reading. So, what else is there to say about this story? There's another account of golf. There's been a couple of those in James. I'm not sure if that's just the time period or if it is. I don't know. I mean, I want to say it's a running thing, but he very explicitly doesn't know anything about golf. He's very clear about that in this. Ah, well. I mean, that's absolutely like the introduction. Like that's an introduction to a ghost story if I've ever heard one. Yeah, a discount antique store. That's the place to find a cursed object. Well, that or stolen objects, but you know, one or the other. Yeah, always a good time. I can't say that I object to buying things that are old or stolen, but yeah. If you see any creepy whistles with particular inscriptions, maybe don't get them. Unless you want a ghost roommate, of course. Don't know why I'd want a ghost roommate though, they don't pay rent. Selfish. But yeah. I don't think there's anything else. I don't know. I'm really starting to sort of draw a picture on these like ghosts. Like, I don't think there's anything about these two in particular I have more to say on, but I'm really starting to sort of puzzle over the nature of these M.R. James stories. That's the thing. I don't know that ghosts do pay rent. That's the problem. When I guess they could like do that thing where ghosts sometimes will tell you about buried treasure they knew of in life, and then you can go find it. But yeah, I don't know. Just be sure you got a good medium on hand if you need to get rid of them, or an exorcist. But yeah, I'm starting to wonder if these are. They strike me as being accounts. I think. I think in my gut, I think these are stories that he's been told by people, like are accounts of true tales. But I'm still not sure. They could very much be fictional. They could be. I just don't know. I like them though. They're all fun, and they all like. I love that. I like that all the characters are logical in that thing. There's no like, all this deep mystery. Let's like delve into it and go mad or whatever. It's okay. This thing has gone wrong. Let's either immediately deal with it as quickly as possible or die. Which, you know, a little grim, but it makes sense. I appreciate it. But yeah, I'll have to see if I can track down any scholarship on it. I am just increasingly curious. But yeah, I think, like I say, I'm not going to push it. Things have been a bit dry around here lately, and I do need to keep my voice intact for at least for tomorrow, which is the only event I have coming up, and then after that we'll push it. But yeah, let's see if anyone is live to raid. Yeah, Plague's live, and it's her birthday. Well, it's not birthday stream, but she's doing her birthday solophon, so we'll stop by there, as long as no one has any objection. But yeah. Other than that, thank you as always to anyone to all of you who have shown up. I know for a fact several people have, and thank you to anyone who has shown up but hasn't said anything. I do appreciate it. And as always, ta-ra.